What I found is 12 distinct forms of language that typically precede acts of genocide.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch in New York City.
But that can precede other acts of violence. So on a scale, it begins with incivility towards a suspect group. Then it moves to opportunistic acts of violence against them. Then it moves to hate crimes. Then it moves to organized acts of violence. Then it moves to acts of terrorism, mass violence against symbolic targets. And then it moves from there.
Elio Fred Garcia is an expert in crisis management and the power of language, both to inspire beliefs and incite actions. Among his books is the very timely Words on Fire, The Power of Incendiary Language and How to Confront It. And he'll be with us today on The State of Belief. As we keep growing our library of extraordinary interviews, I want to make sure that you are subscribed to the State of Belief podcast. Please visit stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You'll hear this episode in full, as well as recent conversations with Dr. Anne-Marie Mingo, Rabbi Sharon Brous, Bishop William Barber, Tim Alberta, and Professor Najiba Saeed. It would really help us if you were to subscribe, rate, and tell people you're close to about all that you've been hearing. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how to do that is available at stateofbelief.com. And you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my guest. Elio Fred Garcia is founder and president of the crisis management firm Logos Consulting Group and executive director of the Logos Institute for Crisis Management and Executive Leadership. A coach, counselor, teacher, and public speaker, Fred's book includes Words on Fire, The Power of Incendiary Language and How to Confront It. He's on the faculty at New York University and Columbia University and is a past chair and longtime member of the board of directors of Interfaith Alliance. Thank you for your service, Elio Fred. As the divisive, dehumanizing language that we've been hearing out of the campaign once again escalates in an election year, I wanted to get an expert take on the power of rhetoric, where it seems to be taking us, and what strategies for resistance may be available. Fred Garcia, welcome back to the State of Belief.
Thank you, Paul. Delighted to be here and delighted to have an opportunity, even in this sad time, to chat about what is going on in the fractured civic life of the nation.
This book was published in 2020, and honestly, it feels like it was written exactly for this moment. I'm just really thankful that you had it wasn't even prescience. You were writing it as it was happening in previous years, but now we need it perhaps more than we've ever needed it. So before we get into it, because we are going to get into it, I was really moved by the opening of this book and how much you shared personal story to set the stage. And I think that, in the end, language affects us personally. It has implications for us, each of us as individuals, as humans. It affects us physically, mentally, spiritually. And I just want to thank you for being so honest about where some of this passion that you have for language comes from. Would you be willing to share just a little bit of your story of coming to this country and what language means to you, given your experience coming here?
Well, thank you for that. I am an immigrant to the United States. I came here from South America a week before first grade, and we came very quickly. My dad got a job, and we came in a hurry, and we didn't have time to learn English. And my mom didn't speak a word of English when we got here. I didn't understand a thing at school. It was a crappy school. And on the very first day, I was hit across the face by a nun because I couldn't understand the instructions, and she thought I was misbehaving. I did very poorly in school, but more than what happened in school, I was the only foreign kid in the school. And this was the mid 1960s. As the only foreign kid, I was the other. I was different. I had an unpronounceable name. I had a very heavy accent. I couldn't understand or speak English very well. And I was the target. And it began with language. It began with taunting. It began with go back to where you came from. It began with people calling me garbled versions of what they thought a Latin name might be, a Latino name might be. But then it escalated to pushing, and then it escalated to punching, and then it escalated to group violence against me, holding me down, kicking me,
Mm.
holding me down, forgive me, urinating on me, holding me down, and hitting me with objects. So if you look very closely, I've got scars around
Mm.
my eyes. They're from boots and other things. I've got a big thing on the back of my head. Now that I don't have hair, it's visible. And that was from a brick. And I was the other, the subject of violence because of my identity. And my passion is not merely for language. My passion is for those who are the subject, who are subject to exclusion, oppression, and violence because of their identity. That is
Mm.
one of the reasons I
Right.
got involved with Interfaith Alliance. That's one of the
Right.
reasons I got involved with the other causes I've been active in.
Yeah.
It's how do we empower?
Just using how language fits into all of that. What you experienced, unfortunately, is all too common. And we have this this thing that we all learned, which was totally wrong. And I don't know who started. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. A complete lie in in a rhyme. But if there's a gift to all of that, which it should never have come to that, is that you have spent a lifetime really looking at the kind of language that precedes. Language itself can be traumatic. We
Yeah.
can be called terrible things, and it can get into our psyche, it can get into our spirit in a terrible way. But it can also lead to further damage, which is physical damage. It can lead to framing a world. So can we start by just a little bit more of how words actually frame us? And you use a term that you attribute to a professor at Berkeley, or retired now, Lakoff. He was very, brilliant in this area. Cognitive unconscious.
Mhm.
What is that? And how can language lead to a cognitive unconscious that actually can inspire action that people may not even be totally aware of why they're doing it?
So language has power. Words have power. And although sticks and stones may break your bones, the words typically precede people picking up the sticks and stones.
Right.
And framing is the creation of a context that makes sense.
Mm.
And as Lakoff says, it triggers the limbic part of the brain, the part of the brain that controls emotion,
Mm-hmm.
the part of the brain that has the fight, flight, freeze trigger, the amygdala, and also the part of the brain where decisions are made. But we
Ooh.
don't have conscious access to that part of our brain. But let me give you a powerful example of framing that has profoundly negative consequences. So, throughout the 2018 midterm election, then President Trump kept referring to migrants seeking asylum as animals.
Mm.
Now, let's take a pause. As you know, asylum can be sought only at a border. You can't apply for it at an embassy or a consulate. So someone seeking asylum comes to the border and declares that they are seeking asylum. Now, that is protected status under American and international law. The people seeking it are here legally.
Mm.
President Trump conflated the idea of illegal, by the way, that's a frame, and animals. And he called those people at the border animals, animals, animals. The word animal triggers a frame, it's a dehumanizing frame.
Right.
What do you do with animals? You put them in cages.
Mm.
You separate their offspring and never return them. you
Mm.
force sterilize them without their consent. So, in the second year of the Trump presidency, the public policy of the United States decided in a meeting in the Situation Room with Stephen Miller, who was the immigration guy for Trump, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Kristen Nielsen, the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, and the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, agreed to separate children from their parents among legal asylum seekers, put them in squalid cages, eventually move the children away without any mechanism for keeping track of which children came from which parents, no mechanism to reunite those children to those parents. Many of those parents were deported back to their
Yeah.
countries, and kids remained here. Now, that is a crime
And
against humanity.
yeah, and
But
that's a perfect example of a framing having implications and not even being aware of like the chicken, the egg, but in some ways it does create a permission. I know many of our listeners are not particularly of a religious tradition. Some very much are. Everyone knows that language is what matters as far as any religious tradition, as far as our moral teachings about the way we understand what it means to be a human, what it means to be in relationship with one another, what it means to be in relationship with the divine. All of this is because we have language that helps us understand it. And when you start to go into language that fractures the relationship between people, fractures the sense of any obligation we might have, it makes it possible to do terrible things. And you actually have a chapter called Less Than Human in this book. I'm going to read the title of the book again because this is a book that was written in 2020, but I tell you people, you're going to read it and you're going to be like, oh my God, this book was written for today. It's called Words on Fire, The Power of Incendiary Language and How to Confront It. You have a chapter called Less Than Human. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today was just in the last week, we've heard incredible language coming out of mouths of politicians, particularly Donald Trump, but then other people. He just said, people are migrants. I don't even think they're human or something like that. I mean,
they're not people. He
not
said they're
people.
not people.
They're not
That is
people.
right.
I mean, isn't that wild to you? I mean,
So what I did is study the patterns. One of the things I do in my work, in my scholarship, in my teaching, is I study patterns of leadership, patterns of language, patterns of audience reaction to that language. And as I studied language that provokes violence, I found a pattern, which I describe in the book.
right.
Now, the U.S. Holocaust Museum Simon Skiat Center for the Prevention of Genocide defines dangerous speech as speech that creates the social conditions that empower or inspire people to commit acts of violence against groups that have been targeted by a charismatic leader.
Mm,
Now, what I found is 12 distinct forms of language that typically precede acts of genocide, but that can precede other acts of violence. So, on a scale, it begins with incivility towards a suspect group. Then it moves to opportunistic acts of violence against them. Then it moves to hate crimes. Then it moves to organized acts of violence. Then it moves to acts of terrorism, mass violence against symbolic targets. And then it moves from there. And we've
yeah.
seen that progression in Trump's language.
I was just looking at the list. Dehumanize, demonize, scapegoat, public health threat. And I just paused there and I was thinking, remember with COVID, because it was called the Chinese flu or
The
something like
China
that. I
virus.
mean,
He called it the China virus.
China virus. That's
Yeah.
right. Thank you. And then we saw an uptick in the attack against Asian people. It's amazing how your kind of lexicon completely tracks along with what we've seen, unfortunately, in recent years.
And the tragedy is, as he was being told what you're saying is putting lives at risk, he continued to say it. So he started calling it the China virus in March of 2020, after my book was submitted to the publisher. So I don't have China virus in the book, but I
Right.
wrote about it at the time in other media. The cry China virus was picked up by his supporters. And in late March, in a Target department store in Texas, a 7 year old young Asian looking child was slashed across the face with a
Mm,
very sharp knife. His father came to his assistance. He was slashed across the face with a very sharp knife.
mm.
The woman who did the slashing was arrested and asked, "Why did you do that?" And she said, "I'm protecting the United States from the China virus."
Oh, see?
Now, that boy was born in the United States of Burmese parents, parents from Myanmar, and all people who were thought to be Asian were at risk. In New York, where I live, there was a Chinese American woman walking home to her apartment in Brooklyn. One of her neighbors was lying in wait on the stoop, and when she came up the stoop, he threw acid in her face
Mm.
simply because she was Asian or seemed to.
Yeah, it all tracks. And we're one of the things that you said is that Trump's language is unprecedented for a president or a candidate. And I think that's right. I mean, this is one of the things that I keep on being like, this isn't normal, and one of the kind of helpful things that you talk about is there have been people in the past who have said things and then others have encouraged them to reflect on what they said, people on all sides of the aisle. But one thing that stuck with me is that something that John McCain started saying about Barack Obama when he was in a fight for the presidency, about him palling around with terrorists or something like that. And someone who McCain respected, who was John Lewis, Representative John Lewis, said, this isn't right. And, to his endless credit, I will say, John McCain, not only on that, but on the question of Muslim identity, shot it down. And he was able to take that advice and say, oh, you know what? I don't want that to be what I'm about. He believed in all of his ideas, conservative ideals, and we can have an honest discussion about that. That's fine. I'm just wondering, I don't know that there's anyone who can say that. I mean, I don't know that he has enough shame or a sense of decency. I'm curious, what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, it did take people whom John McCain respected. Now, it
Yeah,
wasn't Senator McCain who was calling Obama a terrorist, it was his followers.
I got you. I got
But,
you.
but,
Yeah.
but Governor Palin had used the phrase many times, he pals around with terrorists. And pals around with terrorists and is a terrorist is a very fine line. And so pretty
Right.
soon it was he is a terrorist. John Lewis wrote a public letter to John McCain. John Lewis, who's a hero of McCain's, whom
Mm.
Senator McCain wrote about in his autobiography as one of his heroes. So John Lewis says, Senator, you are playing with fire, and I will hold you accountable
Mm.
for the consequences if anything happens to Senator Obama. Now, I got the title of the book, Words on Fire, from
Mm.
John Lewis's admonition on
Oh,
Senator McCain.
wow.
Now, as you rightly point out, the birther conspiracy that Barack Obama was secretly Muslim and secretly Kenyan was in full flower. And the terrorist, and by the way, Muslim to terrorist was a meme that is completely illegitimate, but was powerful back at the time. And Senator McCain paused and he told his campaign staff, we're not doing this anymore.
Mm.
We're not going to. You recall, there was a rally where a woman said, I know
I
this
remember
guy.
it.
And he took the microphone out of her hand and says, no, ma'am. He's a very good family man. He's just somebody I have a political disagreement with.
Yeah.
He lowered the temperature. I
Uh,
can tell you one more that is also very telling. Soon after 9/11, just a few days after 9/11, President George W. Bush was speaking in front of cameras, and he said, we are embarking on a great crusade. Now,
mm-hmm.
he was quoting General Eisenhower just before the Normandy invasion.
Mm.
But the Normandy invasion was nominally Christian countries at war with other nominally Christian countries, and there was no context in which crusade would be interpreted as other than metaphor. But after 9/11, there was already violence against people perceived to be Arab or Muslim.
Right.
And when when President Bush says we are now in a great crusade, Muslim communities around the United States shuddered and said, whoa, we're going to have some trouble here. Interfaith Alliance activated and said, whoa, that's dangerous, and we've got to
Right.
do something to stop that. But Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, recognized it, and he put out the word to President Bush, said, you got to reverse this.
Uh-huh.
This is have consequences. The very next day, President Bush went to the Islamic Center in Washington, surrounded by Muslim clerics, said, the people here with me at the Muslims at the Islamic Center know that Islam is a religion of peace, know that the terrorists are terrorists. They didn't do this out of a religious conviction. They did this for other reasons. We stand together. 2 days later, the Prime Minister of Indonesia visited the White House. It's the largest Muslim country. He did a press conference with her and said, Madam Prime Minister, you are head of the largest Muslim country in the world. We know that Islam is a religion of peace. And the
Yeah.
violence came down. And that's what we need. We need
Yeah.
engaged citizens and
I
civic
mean, I
leaders.
think what you're describing is actually democracy in
Yeah.
action. And also the recognition that in that moment, President Bush said some things that he thought would land. And then, to his credit, he said, no, that's not what I mean, because I
Right.
don't want to alienate. I don't want to dehumanize. I want to bring us together. I can disagree with George Bush on a lot of things, but I think he was sincere in that effort. I think John McCain was sincere in that effort. And I am curious about who in candidates Trump's circles would ever tell him that's out of bounds.
You may recall the book by Anonymous that said there's attempted adult supervision in the West Wing in the Oval Office. And so General
Oh
McMaster
yeah, yeah,
to
yeah,
be
yeah.
the adult supervision, or it was going to be General Mattis was going to be the
Right,
adult
right,
supervision. And he didn't take guidance from anyone.
right,
And in COVID, he didn't take guidance from the people who knew about public health.
right, right.
In national security, he didn't take guidance from his director of the CIA or director of national intelligence. He doesn't take guidance because I believe he has not an ounce of humility.
Mm.
And it is humility that makes empathy possible. And it is humility that creates some form of self-regulation, but he doesn't have self-regulation.
Up next, more with Fred Garcia. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. My guest is Elio Fred Garcia, author of the book Words on Fire, The Power of Incendiary Language and How to Confront It. One of the things that kept on occurring to me, and I think you're exactly the person who can talk to this, is what is the media's role in picking up this rhetoric, reporting on it, and then what does that do? I'm really curious as a media expert. What is the media's role here?
So, as you know, I have a chapter in the book that describes how we got here.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways we got here is what I call essentially a braid of three forces that sort of braided together into one phenomenon. That's the shifting of television news from public service to spectacle. The second is the hyper polarization in American politics that I trace back to Newt Gingrich's speakership. And the third is the dumbing down of the American public. And there's a whole bunch of social psychology behind how we got there just from a public standpoint. But with respect to the news media, I point out that in February of 2016, so essentially 7 months before the election, the chairman of CBS was speaking at a JP Morgan investment conference to investors. And he said, what's happening today, what Donald is doing, is a three-ring circus. And we've never seen anything like this before. Donald, keep it up. It may be bad for the United States, but it's great for CBS.
Mm.
It may be bad for the United States, but it's great for CBS. Think about that.
Mm-hmm.
I have, as you know, the former honorary chair of Interfaith Alliance was Walter Cronkite. I was invited to meet with Mr. Cronkite as sort of the tickler to get me involved with the Interfaith Alliance board back in 2004. But when I sat with Mr. Cronkite and I took copious notes on a cocktail napkin, I asked him what he thought of what was happening in the political campaign between George W. Bush and John Kerry. And he paused for a moment and he said, you know, in my day, we never talked about ratings. We never talked about budget. If we needed to open a bureau in Johannesburg, we'd open a bureau in Johannesburg. We didn't have to ask permission. We never had to talk to the corporate side about anything. We were left alone. And Jack Paley, who was then running CBS, said, I've never made a dime from the news, but it's the best investment I've ever made.
Mm.
The change is when the companies that owned the news organizations, were primarily family companies, sold out and the conglomerates bought them. So CBS was bought by Westinghouse. It eventually became part of a much bigger conglomerate. NBC was bought by General Electric. ABC was bought by Disney. And suddenly they had budgets and they needed to make numbers. And they were part of what is sometimes called the greater content business. So you've got pure facts and data on this side, like Bloomberg terminals, and you've got pure entertainment on this side. And the news is somewhere in the middle. And as a result, they default to what does it take to keep the audience? And so we saw in 2015, half an hour of an empty podium waiting for Trump to arrive because he might say something when he arrives and they didn't want to miss it. When I came out with a book in 2020, because I had a chapter that was deeply critical of the media, I couldn't get booked on television. And the producers would tell me, you're exaggerating. You're exaggerating. There's no relationship between the language and the violence. Well, now it's all relationship to language and violence all the time on most networks. Yeah. They continue to put it on the air.
Yeah. Is the solution to not cover it? Or is the solution to cover it with a real sophistication about what it means? I mean, this is the debate. And I'm not exempt. I mean, I was at Huffington Post and, we had something called the Westboro Baptist Church, which I'm sure you know about.
You know well.
Kind of silly people who were clickbait every single time. And the question was should we cover another stupid thing that the Westboro Baptist Church does because it will get 1 million clicks? Or do we ignore it and let our competition get 1 million clicks? I had to make those kind of decisions. We mostly did cover it, but we kind of framed it as those silly people again. But I do think that the question right now is how much people are just picking up on this. And the other thing is people are bypassing the media and going straight to QAnon. They're getting their information in all sorts of different places, but it's just hard to know what really is the role of the media in this moment in our democracy, and how can they really help us with the question of language and how to inoculate against it.
I've seen a shift, at least in much of the mainstream media, from over-indexing on what they consider balance and recalibrating to greater truth.
Uh-huh.
So here's an example. It's analogous. From the beginning of the Trump presidency, it was very unusual for any journalist on television to say that what the president said was a lie.
Uh-huh.
So it was inaccurate, right. But they never called it a lie until a tipping point, and suddenly everyone was calling it a lie. But it took the Washington Post continuing to document 30,000 lies over 4 years, including 50 a day in the last weeks of the 2020 campaign. It took that for journalists to stop using euphemism and to say that's a lie. We've
Yeah.
seen the same thing now with violence provoking language. And that is now it's far more likely for an anchor to say that's dangerous language that has been shown
Uh-huh.
to inspire people to commit violence.
That's
Yes,
hopeful.
they
Yeah.
should cover it and point to the risk. But
Right.
but there was this attempt to seem fair and balanced,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, no,
but
I think
at
that's
the
right.
expense of the truth.
Yeah, right. I think that that's exactly right. I'm a pastor and president of Interfaith Alliance, and am very interested in how religion is being accessed, manipulated, rallied in this moment. And my guess is that if we look at a lot of the rhetoric that is coming out, it is in some ways, this idea of Christian nationalism as under, really an inspiring phenomenon. Like, you're losing your country. You're losing what makes this country a real America, which is its Christian identity, which is its white male identity, Protestant identity. And I'm just curious, looking at language and how you're seeing religious imagery or religious language being infused into all of this dangerous rhetoric.
So for 20 years, I was an advisor, and for 10 of those years on the board of Religions for Peace. I've also been a professor of religious leadership at a Unitarian Universalist Theological Seminary, where I also served on the board and as board chair. And in all of those and in the Interfaith Alliance, one of the patterns I've seen is the co-opting of religious identity for political or social purposes. But what we find is the religious values that are common among faith traditions are not the religious values that are often articulated by those people who are using the identity of religion for other reasons,
Mm.
whether it's Christian nationalism or Islamic State, or during the Troubles in Britain and Ireland, the purported Catholics and Protestants. That was not a theological debate.
Mm-hmm.
That
Right.
was not a debate about uh, the embodiment of Christ and things like that. That was a political debate
Right.
using religious identity as a marker. And so
Mm.
what we find is the identity of religion is often hijacked for political purposes, sometimes by whole traditions, but very often by opportunists
Mm-hmm.
who are trying to do something else. Now, Christian nationalism, in my view, is neither Christian nor particularly patriotic. It
Right.
is actually the opposite of my understanding of Christianity and my understanding of what it means to be patriotic. But it is being used to divide and oppress. It is being used to change society in ways that are far more socially challenging. There's some people who are select, and there are some people who are not.
Right.
And this the worthy and the unworthy
Right.
is,
Well, it gets
is
back to who really counts, who are the full Americans, which is like in some ways, humans in this country, and who are here because we're letting them be here or we're not going to let them be here. And so like we're seeing
or
rhetoric like if they don't like our religion, we're
leave.
going to send them back wherever,
Right.
whatever that means. Like, first of all, what's our religion? That's
Right.
saying something. And then who's they? I think also there's so much almost apocalyptic rhetoric used. Like, I will be your retribution,
Right.
which is
It'll be
very
bloodbath.
much bloodbath. It's so interesting because when you get into apocalyptic and then you get into like this great moment in history and you're taking essentially on the persona of Christ in some ways, if you're looking at the book of Revelation, you're becoming this figure. And I just think it's so funny. I remember when Obama was running and we kept on hearing, "Oh, you think he's the Messiah." None of us thought he was the Messiah. That was never something we would have said. We never would have given him that kind of elevation in that way. He did bring some hope, and that was good. but he was not, we never viewed him as a religious figure at all. And I think that what we're seeing now is like, this, all of these paintings of, it becomes absurd, like Jesus sitting in the courtroom with Trump and like,
Right.
best pals. And
I don't recall a single progressive ever using the language of he's the Messiah.
mm-mm.
But I do note that soon after he took office, there was a string of purported religious leaders who, including going on Rachel Maddow, to say, we now believe that he is the Antichrist or the
Oh,
foreshadowing of the Antichrist.
oh, wow.
So it was the opponents to Obama
Right.
who were trying to find a theological, biblical
Mm,
interpretation,
mm.
delegitimize him. By the way, that's play two in the playbook is to
Right.
demonize, delegitimize.
Right.
And precisely what they were doing. But everything you're describing, Paul, is in the playbook. The
Right.
language of apocalyptic language,
Right.
the language of it's going to be a bloodbath. The countries we're going to lose the country as we know it.
Right.
Uh, all of that is
Well,
language intended to stir up and
yeah.
get people to essentially rise up and
Yeah.
to support their guy.
Right. We're going to get to something hopeful soon. I promise our listeners. But before we get there, I want to say one more alarmist thing. And I'm sorry this is so alarmist, but I am alarmed. One of the things you talk about is like, and we were talking about this identity. What does it mean to be part of an us versus them thing? You spend quite a bit of time about like the terrible things of course, Nazi Germany, but also Rwanda, and what it means when you really start creating this a sense of complete us versus them. There's no gray. There's no ways that we might work together on some things and disagree on others, and we might compromise and nobody's going to get everything they want. It's a zero-sum game, and it has spiritual implications and it has patriotic implications, and so we have to win. And I think that there's precedent, and it's none of it is good.
The patterns are very clear. And here's something else. We saw this during the Obama presidency, but we also see it playing out every day. It used to be you and I disagree on just about everything, but we can find common ground. Now it's you're evil. You don't negotiate with evil. You
Right.
don't
Right.
compromise with evil. And so
Right.
that's one of the things we're seeing in Congress, in the fractured Congress, is anyone who tries to negotiate with the other side is suddenly demonized by their own side.
Right.
And that, as a result, there's no legislation of any significance coming out of Congress right now.
Right.
But let's go back to the us them. Uh, there's some really interesting scholarship that I point to in the book by a professor in Florida named Robert Borum, and he says there's a way that people get into the mindset of committing violence, and they take any given event and they say first that's not right. It then morphs into that's not fair. It then morphs into it's their fault. And then it morphs into they're evil, they're less than human. That's the progression that leads people to want to take up arms or otherwise cause harm to people. That it's not right, it's not fair, it's their fault, they're not human, they're evil. But notice that is precisely the language Trump uses. So it's
Mm.
not that his followers come to that conclusion on their own. They're led to that conclusion. And once you define that group as evil, then you think you're doing something noble. So
Right.
notice a lot of the January 6th defendants, as their defense said, I was just doing what the president told me. I was just doing what the commander in
Yeah.
chief need to do
Yeah.
because he told us to do that.
I don't have a lot of sympathy for what happened on January 6th, but sometimes your heart does break because they actually thought they were led to believe that they were saving their country. They were
And
led by a whole infrastructure. One, it's very interesting, God and Country. I don't know if you've had a chance to see that movie yet, but it is very interesting, the Rob Reiner film about Christian nationalism. The day before, there were all these prayer
yeah,
services where
yeah,
God has ordained that Trump won. And so anything that mitigates that
right,
win is
right.
obviously anti-God and is also like just not true. And so they felt like they were doing something in service of God and in service of country because they were given that frame intentionally. And so one of the things that I want to turn to is what should we do? I mean, you and I are people who who talk to a lot of people, and our listeners know a lot of people. What are the, name your number, three things that each of us should be thinking about the way we talk? Because I can find myself getting into defensive pose and beginning to come at people. I'm just wondering, like, what are the ways that we can not become what we hate, one,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
and also really use language in a way that inspires. You actually start with this, and then I want you to answer it. You talk about FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his "We have nothing to fear but fear itself" speech, and what that meant, and the use of language for unification, the use of language for meeting a moment. And so language, we've been talking about all the bad ways that language can be, but it can be done all the other ways.
So I think there's two things we need to focus on. First is how do we use language well, but secondly, how do we call out when others are using language in ways that demonize or dehumanize?
Mm.
And in all the time I've been writing about and speaking about Trump, I have intentionally avoided dehumanizing and demonizing him. I speak about his behavior. I don't
Uh-huh.
speak about his identity.
Uh-huh.
People have asked me, do you believe he is evil? I say, I'm not going to use that language.
Uh-huh.
That plays into the mindset that he is
Right.
using. And so I am going to describe behavior and not identity. That's the first thing. The second thing is uh, we can notice when others, perhaps inadvertently, use demonizing and dehumanizing language. So, for example, at a school board meeting,
Mm.
we can hear if
Mm.
somebody is dehumanizing or demonizing someone, a teacher, a student, a member of the board. We can call that out
Mm.
at a family gathering. We can call it out. We can teach our children not to use that kind of language. Uh, this isn't just something that is done at the national level with John McCain and John Lewis. This is something that can be done in everyday life.
Yeah.
That we know that there are patterns of speech that make it more likely that people will commit violence
Mm.
because of what happens to the target of that speech. That target is dehumanized and demonized. We can call it out. We can say
Yeah.
that's inappropriate. We can say I will hold you accountable for the consequences of that, as John Lewis said to John
Uh-huh.
McCain.
Yeah.
That we can, at whatever level of society we happen to be at, we can be diligent and say this demonization and dehumanization stops with me. I'm
Mm.
going to be the person who lives by the standard. And behavior that we walk past is behavior we condone. And so we need to call it out when we see it. The
Mm.
second is to recognize that framing is a very powerful force for good and bad. That framing, as you point out with FDR, or I also quote Churchill, we shall fight on the beaches and the landing grounds, etc. We shall never surrender. Well, that's a frame. And if the frame is we shall never surrender, then negotiating with the Germans isn't going to happen. Instead, if we don't win, they will destroy us. So we need to win. That was Churchill's frame, and that's what got people through World War II. We also saw Kennedy on the moonshot. Says we do these and the other things not because they are easy, but because they are hard,
Mm.
because they bring out of us the best that is in us. And that kind of rhetoric not only inspires, but it leads to behavior.
Mm.
All three of those leaders that I quote in the first chapter, they took a scared and anxious nation in each instance. And that was the beginning. Each of those speeches was in the first months of their time as senior leaders of their nations. They turned the spirit of their citizens around and fortified them for the difficult task ahead. In the case of Churchill, it was war. In the case of FDR, it was depression. In the case of Kennedy, it was the Cold War. But those are examples of leaders who used language intentionally, and it had an effect, not just on how people felt, but on their behavior. And that's
Right.
the part about the power of language.
Right. And it
It,
doesn't have to be heads of state. I'm thinking about people like King or people like Heschel or people like Gandhi. All these people gave a frame that was seeped with a religious language, but also, interestingly, often transcended the particularity of the language, but gave people a way to not only imagine, but as you say, behave. And it's such a gift when you receive that. And I often receive that actually on this show, where I hear someone talking about something for the first time. I had never considered it that way. And I'm like, oh, God, thank you. Like, I'll never see it the same again. And my behavior has to also follow that. So I just think it's really important for, again, for everyday people to not feel like this is only something that heads of state do, but also that we do it for our families, we do it for our friends.
And what I'm doing when in my teaching and in my writing is I follow the precepts that I was taught by Plato. And that is in the Republic, he says, if you want to learn something difficult, study the biggest instance of it that you can, because the patterns are the same in the big and the small,
Uh,
but the big is easier to see. So study the big and then apply it to the small. And he says the patterns are put up in heaven for any who wishes to contemplate those patterns.
mm,
So my pedagogical method is I study the big and derive lessons that can be applied to the small.
yeah.
My next book is on COVID-19 and the failure of the US response to COVID-19, but it's not intended to be necessarily a critique of the guy who was in charge, although it is. But it's really about how people in the crisis business can learn the lessons
Mm,
from the patterns we can see on the biggest crisis of our lifetime and all of the decisions that led to it getting worse. And then we can go back to our clients and bosses and say, hey, this never works. Look at what happened there. And
yeah.
so we look at the big to apply to the small.
Mm,
And so no, you don't have to be a head of state, but you can use the same technique as the head of state did. Or
mm-hmm.
you don't need to be a candidate for president of the United States to dehumanize. You can dehumanize at a school board meeting. You can dehumanize
Right,
in the
right.
playground.
Yeah.
I was dehumanized in the playground. I
Uh-huh,
was
right.
dehumanized in the school bus. And there was
Yeah.
nobody there that had any capacity to intervene even before the violence took place against me.
Right, right, right. And what I hope that we can all be are the people who can be there and offer a different frame for the bullies who attacked you, and help them to imagine a different world, and help all of us imagine a different world where no one is dehumanizing. This is our great work. We end this show always by asking our guests what gives them hope. Elio Fred Garcia, what gives you hope?
There are many, many people of goodwill who are working very, very hard to protect all of us in many ways. And we need to honor the people who are working very hard. We saw in COVID just how many people were working very, very hard to protect us. We see now in the political sphere just how many people are working very, very hard to protect us. And yes, those who mean to harm others, to deprive them of rights, to commit violence against them are formidable and scary. But we're not alone. There are civic institutions, Interfaith Alliance.
Hmm.
There are people of goodwill who are not affiliated with civic institutions, but who are committed to a just and fair and hopeful economy, a hopeful social fabric, hopeful public life. And we need to not give up because giving up yields to the oppressor. And we need to maintain our hope as Dr. King did,
Hmm.
as John Lewis did. We can learn from those heroes, again, per Plato, and apply them to smaller circumstances.
Elio Fred Garcia is the author of the book Words on Fire: The Power of Incendiary Language and How to Confront It. An expert on crisis management, Fred is the founder and president of Logos Consulting Group. He's been teaching at New York University for 36 years and is an adjunct professor at Columbia University. Fred is a past chair and longtime member of the board of directors of Interfaith Alliance. Fred's other books include The Power of Communication, Skills to Build Trust, Inspire Loyalty, and Lead Effectively, and The Agony of Decision, Mental Readiness and Leadership in a Crisis. Fred, thank you so much again for being part of the State of Belief. Really appreciate all your wisdom.
Thank you, Paul, so much.
Please be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. We need your help to keep making The State of Belief. Become a partner in this crucial work with a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And share what you're getting out of the show with the people in your networks. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going on Facebook and Instagram with the handle @stateofbelief. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.